Hey guys. Tonight, we drop quietly behind the opulent gates of Topkapi Palace, where marble glimmers and silence has power. You're not a sultan. You're not even a soldier. You're something in between, and somehow below an African-born eunuch, surgically altered, shipped halfway across the world, and now swaddled in silk to serve a world you'll never truly belong to. There's gold leaf on the ceilings, sure, but let's just say your own ceiling is made of something less shiny. The good news, you're alive. The bad, you're trapped in a velvet cage with no key and no legacy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your local time and where you're watching from. Are you nestled in a blanket in Boston? Or hiding from the heat in Hanoi now? Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyelids peel open just before the muezzin's call. Not because of devotion, but because of duty. You're not allowed to sleep past sunrise. In fact, you're not allowed to do much at all without someone else's permission. You lie on a woven mat tucked neatly into a corner of the black eunuch's quarters, technically in the harem wing, but also very much not of it. There's a sweet sour scent of sandalwood lingering in the air, either from incense or the skin ointment someone spilled. Your limbs are stiff, and your thighs still ache not from last night's labor, but from a general sense of existence. This is not a body made for leisure. Outside your quarters, everything looks majestic. Domed roofs catching the morning glow. Blue Iznik tiles curling across every wall like trapped oceans. You can hear birds, fountains, footsteps, but never laughter. That's the rule. Joy is for others. You are here to serve, to guard, and to vanish. Ironically, your status as a eunuch gives you access no free man could dream of. You can walk past armed guards into the women's quarters. You can deliver secret scrolls. You can sit beside the Valide Sultan, mother of the emperor. You just can't touch, or speak, or leave. Historians still argue whether eunuchs held real influence or were simply ceremonial houseplants dressed in velvet. One thing's for sure, your job is invisible until it isn't. Get a name wrong. Break eye contact for too long, breathe at the wrong rhythm, and you'll be replaced, reassigned, or mysteriously absent by morning. There's one bizarre comfort: you're not alone. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Agassi, holds terrifying power. He commands the entire harem staff and often acts as the Sultan's most trusted intermediary. But even he can vanish. You've seen it happen once. A whisper in the bathhouse, then gone, replaced by another man with the same title, same robes, same eyes that never blink. The transformation that brought you here, we don't talk about it, but you remember it. Most do. Some recall the moment with foggy clarity, the biting cloth, the heat, the scream that wasn't theirs. Others simply remember waking up groggy in a boat, somewhere on the Nile, belly stitched and body changed. That memory is stitched inside you, too. You've been gifted with literacy, obedience, and an eerie silence that unnerves the concubines. Some call you Agabe, older brother. Others avoid your gaze. You're neither man nor woman, neither servant nor noble. You are, in effect, an architectural feature, ornate, immovable, and expected to never collapse. But collapse you do, eventually. Not physically, that's frowned upon, but mentally. You start measuring your years, not in birthdays, but in seasons of harem politics. You grow excellent at reading eyes, doors, footsteps. You know which pillow arrangement means the Sultan has visited, which silk robe belongs to which wife, which servant is due to vanish next. Historians debate whether eunuchs like you were grateful for their elevated roles or haunted by them. You're not sure either, but you are awake, and that means the day has begun. You shuffle from your mat to the polished stone corridor, feet bare, the floor oddly cold for Istanbul's warmth. The harem hasn't woken yet, not officially. But your day begins before the sun, because your life isn't measured in hours or meals, but in duties stacked like delicate porcelain bowls. You pass through archways where other men would lose their heads for trespassing. You don't lose yours not because you're powerful, but because you're not a man in the way that matters here. Your sleeping quarters were sparse one mat, a small wooden chest, and a lamp whose oil is rationed tighter than affection. The other eunuchs snore lightly behind screens, arranged with perfect symmetry. No one talks. Conversation, when it happens, is clipped and necessity-bound. The silence is deafening, broken only by the echo of sandals and the constant trickle of water from unseen fountains. Welcome to your 5-star prison. The chief eunuch's steward hands you your schedule, written in Arabic calligraphy too beautiful for what it actually means: errands, messages, surveillance, floral arrangements, and tonight, standing silently behind the Sultan's favored concubine while she plays the oud. You are the unblinking shadow in every glamorous corner. Bathing is allowed twice a week. But this morning, it's just a face wipe with rose water. No, not because you're dainty. Because a full bath would require permission, time, and water someone else decides you deserve. Plus, it's dangerous to let your pores relax too much. People might assume you're not sufficiently tense. You change into your daily uniform layered robes of light silk, black in color, always black. Not because it flatters, but because it blends. The belt is gold-threaded, more valuable than everything you own except it isn't yours, like your name. You had another, once, but it was replaced with one more palatable for Ottoman court tongues. You move to the side hall to begin morning inspections. The concubines will soon awaken, and your job is to ensure their path is smooth. Not too smooth, though that raises suspicion. You check for anything unusual. A curtain drawn oddly, a scent out of place, a slipper missing. These are not trivial details. In the harem, a misplaced sandal can trigger a scandal. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs were passive observers or covert puppeteers of the palace. But you know better. You've slipped notes under pillows, watched the Valide Sultan bribe an astrologer, delivered coded messages sealed with almond paste, and watched women cry into cushions because the Sultan never came. There's a story whispered among the eunuchs about one of your predecessors. He had climbed high, too high, became confidant to both the Valide and the Sultan. Then one day, his voice was too loud in a hallway. That night, he was found in the Bosphorus, still smiling. They say if you pass his spot at night, you can still hear humming. Your own voice is rare, both in use and in tone. Some eunuchs lost it during the procedure. Others, like you, simply stopped using it. The less you say, the less you risk. It's not silence out of fear. It's silence as survival strategy. You've learned that speaking truth in this palace is like drinking from the cistern, potentially fatal. Breakfast: a dry fig, a few almonds, and a spoonful of honeyed yogurt. You eat it standing, facing the wall, in case a noblewoman passes by. You're not allowed to face them while chewing. A royal mouth should never see a working one in motion. Outside, the azans begin echoing across the city. Doves flutter above the marble domes, and you glimpse the edge of a courtyard garden where concubines will soon walk in silk slippers, laughing like wind chimes. You'll walk behind them, silently, watchfully, always too close to be ignored, yet too invisible to matter. And that is the irony of being a palace eunuch. You know, everyone's secrets, but no one knows yours. You stumble out of the barracks, only half-dressed, and the first pressing issue of the day hits you, not breakfast. Not the eunuch training drills, but something far more urgent where to relieve yourself. Because here's the fun part about palace life. You may serve royalty. You may dress the sultan's concubines, but you're still very much human. Which means your intestines don't respect imperial schedules. The lavatories, if you can call them that, are a well-orchestrated disaster. Technically, there are toilets in the palace complex, but don't imagine anything ceramic, private, or remotely dignified. Think instead of rows of holes cut into marble benches with absolutely no partitions. You squat alongside your coworkers like it's a weekly staff meeting. And if the wind is blowing wrong, the conversation becomes a nose-stinging event. There's no toilet paper. That's a modern fantasy. You're lucky if there's a clay water jug nearby, which you use with your left hand, always the left, by the way, which becomes a lifelong stigma you never quite escape. Soap, hilarious. What soap you're expected to rinse off with cold water. Pray for spiritual cleansing, and get back to work without ever mentioning what just happened. Historians still argue whether eunuchs in the Topkapi Palace had exclusive latrine access. Some claim the black eunuchs guarding the harem had designated wash areas, but if they did, no one left a Yelp review. What we know for sure is that sanitation ranked somewhere between optional and completely mythical. And then there's the smell. The smell doesn't just exist in the latrines, it follows you. It clings to your robes, creeps into your bedding, and sometimes becomes so familiar you miss it when it's gone. You tell yourself it's part of the sacred architecture, like the scent of incense or lemon oil, but deep down, you know, it's just decades of poorly buried waste. Want privacy? Try being born in a different century. The concept doesn't exist in the Ottoman palace. Every bodily function is a community event shared, smelled, judged silently. Once, you caught a glimpse of a janissary tiptoeing out of the harem side pit, whistling like he hadn't just dropped off last night's lentils. That's the kind of denial you aspire to. Also, fun trivia: the palace cats. Yes, they sneak in. They love the warmth of the latrine stones and occasionally fall asleep right next to the drains. You begin to associate feline purring with urination, which, needless to say, does a number on your future relationships. So you finish your business, rinse your shame, and walk out like nothing happened. But in your heart, you know, you were just a participant in history's worst communal bathroom experience. And it will happen again before sundown. Twice. If the kitchen serves lentils again. You'd think, after surviving the morning's bathroom lottery, the next logical reward would be food, something warm, comforting, nourishing, hilarious. Instead, you get gruel, and not the warm, Dickensian kind. This is the Ottoman palace version, a grayish sludge of lentils and barley, overcooked to glue-like consistency, flavored faintly with regret, and possibly, if you're lucky, a pinch of onion. Breakfast, lunch. Dinner, it's mostly the same. Porridge variants dominate your diet. And if you're low-ranking, which you are, meat is just a myth told by senior eunuchs to keep you hopeful. You're given something called azure once a year during a festival sweet porridge with nuts and dried fruit. It's the best thing you've ever eaten, and it makes you weep. Mostly because you know you won't see it again until next Muharram. You don't eat with forks, of course. This is the 1500s. You sit cross-legged on mats and share wide metal trays with 5 to 8 other eunuchs. Everyone dips their hand into the same stew, tearing at bread that could honestly double as medieval weaponry. Hard, stale, and dense enough to deflect a musket ball. Historians still argue whether Ottoman rations were better than those of contemporary European armies. Short answer, it's a low bar, and everyone limboed under it. Water. Not unless you want dysentery as a roommate. The kitchen boys boil it when they remember, but usually they don't. Wine is forbidden. Of course, You're a eunuch in the imperial palace, not a drunken Greek poet. So you drink sherbet, not the fizzy powder, but a sort of diluted fruit syrup that tastes like melted cough drops. Occasionally, rose water is added, which sounds fancy until you realize it's meant to disguise spoilage. Sometimes you carry trays into the harem or to visiting dignitaries and see their meals. Roasted lamb, pilaf with saffron, honey-soaked pastries. You aren't allowed to speak to the concubines, but your stomach screams at them through your rib cage. You catch the scent of cardamom and feel briefly possessed by the spirit of a starving street dog. There is one upside: you never overeat. The portions are scientifically designed to keep you on the edge of starvation without actually dying. You could rob a pantry, sure, but palace punishments are wildly creative. One story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, involves a thief being locked in a spice cellar and forced to sneeze for 3 days straight. You learn to cope. You learn to chew slowly. You learn that hunger is not just a physical feeling. It's a lifestyle, a roommate, a tiny ghost inside your belly that whispers. You could eat a sandal right now and feel full. So you finish your meal. Your hands are sticky with grease and barley paste. There's no napkin. You wipe them on your robes because so does everyone else. Then you stand up, bones creaking, and prepare for another full day of service. And just for the record, yes, you're still hungry. You glance down at yourself, hoping for even a sliver of comfort. Spoiler, there isn't one. Your clothing, issued by the palace quartermaster, is a triumph of form over function. It's technically linen, at least. That's what they call it, but it has the scratchy texture of an old broom and the breathability of wet parchment. The uniform is shapeless, beige, and designed to make you blend into the architecture, which is ironic because the architecture is at least tastefully colorful. You own exactly one set of these glorious robes. You wear them every day, sleep in them every night, and wash them well. Never. Because washing involves time, soap, water, and the will to live. And no, you don't have shoes in the way you'd understand them. You have leather foot wraps tied with frayed cords, which do little more than gather dust and disease. What about undergarments? You ask, innocence. There's nothing under the robe. Not that it matters much, remember. You're a eunuch. Your body's been edited like a censored scroll, leaving behind what historians still argue was either a cleaner vessel for service or just a horrifying overreach of palace control. Either way, Breezy doesn't begin to cover it. The weather's not your friend either. In winter, these threadbare layers trap cold like a sponge traps despair. In summer, they turn into personal saunas. And since deodorant, breathable fabrics, and even daily bathing are futuristic luxuries, everyone smells like sour cumin and week-old bread. You don't even notice it anymore. It's the smell of employment. Your bald head shines under the torchlight not for style, but for hygiene. The Ottomans shaved eunuchs regularly to prevent lice. Though ironically, lice still show up like they're on vacation. And when they do, you get dusted with sulfur powder or vinegar, which burns your scalp and makes your eyes water, but doesn't actually solve the problem. It's like fighting a flood with a wet sponge. Jewelry, no. Color forbidden. Expression through fashion, that's for the sultans, the viziers, the elite women of the harem. You're part of the palace engine, and engines don't accessorize, if you even look too well dressed. Someone might mistake you for a spy, or worse, a favorite. And being a favorite in a palace filled with jealous rivals is a lot like being the juiciest kebab at a lion convention. Still, there's one small, ridiculous perk. Once a month, for ceremonial reasons, you wear a slightly fancier version of your robe. It has embroidery, in beige. You parade in it during certain processions, looking like a very polite curtain. The embroidery itches like guilt and impresses no one, but at least it reminds you that somewhere deep in the bureaucracy, someone still acknowledges your existence. And then it's back to the usual sweaty, stiff, and stained. You shuffle past ornate tiles and golden latticework in clothing that hasn't been changed since Ramadan. Your armpits chafe. Your ankles itch. Your collar smells like old soup. But you carry on, because that's what you're here for: modesty, monotony, and the slow disintegration of your wardrobe and spirit in equal measure. Your teeth hurt. They always do. Not in the way modern people complain about sensitivity to cold drinks, but in the deep, throbbing way that says your molar is a rotting piece of wood and your gums are planning a mutiny. You wake up with a dull ache. By midday, it's sharp. By evening, you're praying to every Ottoman saint and proto-dentist for the sweet release of unconsciousness. The palace doesn't have dentists. It has barber surgeons, the same men who cut hair, apply leeches, and occasionally amputate limbs with rusted knives and encouraging words. Toothaches are treated with clove oil, if you're lucky, and fire, if you're not. One eunuch had a tooth pulled last week using a hot iron and forceps the size of a turkey leg. He hasn't spoken since. There are no toothbrushes. Instead, you chew on neem sticks or rub salt and ash along your gums, which sounds holistic until you realize the ash may include camel dung. Oral hygiene is not so much a daily ritual as a slow war of attrition between your face and the bacteria colonizing it. And no, there's no toothpaste. Unless you count crushed herbs and talc mixed with rose water, which smells divine and does absolutely nothing. You learn not to smile too wide. Most eunuchs have at least 3 teeth in permanent retirement. Some have blackened incisors, the result of sugar, a luxury among the elite, who treat sweets like trophies and your mouth like collateral damage. Even fruit, which is technically healthy, can rot your teeth faster than the heat can sour your milk. And speaking of medicine, good luck. The Ottoman medical system is fascinating and almost helpful if you're an aristocrat or the Sultan's horse. But you get bled, literally. If your gums swell or your breath smells like a dying goat. You're diagnosed with excess bile or imbalanced humors, and a man with a blade opens a vein and says it'll help. Historians still argue whether bloodletting was a sincere belief or just an excuse to stab people for fun. But let's not forget the fringe treatments. One palace record mentions using pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar as a mouth rinse. Another suggests a concoction of crushed pearls and honey. Both are expensive. Neither works. But they do make your breath smell expensive, which is apparently the point. Cavities, they're like uninvited house guests. You feel them forming, but can't kick them out. They turn into infections, which become abscesses, which eventually rupture or kill you, or both. A fellow servant once collapsed while serving sherbet to the Sultan's favorite concubine. Turned out his jawbone had partially dissolved. The only mercy. The Sultan thought it was divine punishment and declared him purified. The rest of us called it unpaid dental leave. Pain becomes your default state. You chew with one side of your mouth. Sip tepid water to avoid the shock. And try not to cry when your gums throb like tiny war drums. You can't focus. You snap at colleagues. You daydream about modern anesthesia like it's a forbidden fantasy. There are no minty mouthwashes, no dental floss, no fluoride, just bleeding gums, grinding pain, and the quiet dignity of suffering in robes that smell like mildew and boiled grain. You learn to live with it, sort of, because in the Ottoman palace, your teeth don't serve you, they're just waiting to betray you. Your day begins long before the sun even thinks about rising. The air is damp with yesterday's sweat, and your body already aches, which is impressive, considering you haven't stood up yet You think, surely I'll get a break today. And that's cute, because rest not for eunuchs. In the Ottoman palace, hard labor is your love language, and it's clingy. You're expected to be invisible and omnipresent at the same time. You stand behind ornate curtains, listening for the swish of a royal robe. You memorize footsteps. You carry heavy trays with the delicacy of a swan and the spine of a draft horse. If you make a sound, you're scolded. If you drop something, you're dead. Not metaphorically actually dead if it happens during a formal audience. Welcome to the tightrope of servitude. The workload is relentless. You scrub floors polished enough to blind people. You lift water jars heavier than your will to live. You maintain silk garments so sheer that looking at them feels like a sin, and you wash them by hand, with no gloves, in water that's half soap, half bacteria. And don't think for a moment that palace eunuchs are spared from outside work. You escort dignitaries across sun-scorched courtyards, hold torches for nighttime ceremonies, and occasionally dig drainage trenches during heavy rains. It's a fascinating skill set bodyguard, valet, housekeeper, and ceremonial prop. Women in the harem have it no better. You see them moving like shadows behind lattice screens. Their labor is emotional, staying pretty, staying poised, staying politically useful. But yours is physical. You are the muscle that supports the entire illusion of effortless luxury. Behind every soft cushion is someone like you, bent double, stuffing it. Children. They don't exist in your world, not yours, not theirs, but in the streets of Constantinople. They start hauling water buckets and sweeping courtyards by the age of 5. Child labor isn't a problem. It's a solution. And yes, they cry, quietly. Nobody likes a noisy child, especially not their exhausted parents. You eat just enough to keep functioning and sleep just enough to stay conscious. And when you do rest, it's never real. You lie on a straw mat that whispers to your spine. We used to be wheat. Your arms tingle. Your legs twitch. You dream about just sitting and doing nothing. But in your dreams, even chairs come with chores. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were treated better or worse than enslaved field laborers. On paper, you have status. You serve the sultan. You touch priceless objects. You whisper secrets in tiled halls. But when your back screams, when your knees throb, when your hands blister from polishing gold that isn't yours, you wonder if the fields were kinder. At least there, you could scream into the sky. Here, you have to smile. Fringe sources mention a eunuch who ran away, just vanished through the bathhouse drain tunnels. They say he opened a bakery somewhere in Anatolia and lived happily ever after. They also say he was captured a month later and returned with fewer fingers. As motivational tales go, it's got mixed reviews. Your only reward? Survival. Not favor, not freedom. Just another day without being replaced. Because there are always more candidates, more boys from distant provinces, more prisoners of war, more parents selling children they'll never see again. The system doesn't love you. It tolerates you. So you stay useful. You stay quiet. You stay moving. And the labor never ends. Summer makes you sweat in places you didn't know existed. Winter makes you wish you hadn't. The Ottoman palace, despite its gilded arches and tiled halls, is basically a climate-controlled lie. And by climate-controlled, we mean completely at the mercy of nature. There's no central heating. There are no fans. There are open-air courtyards that turn into ovens by noon and iceboxes by midnight. And your chambers? Let's just say the architecture was designed for aesthetics, not insulation. In winter, the walls leak cold like gossip. In summer, the marble floors are hotter than your forehead during a public scolding. You try to stay warm by layering your linen garments. But guess what? Linen is breathable, which is helpful in heat and hopeless in cold. So you shiver. You curl up in corners. You press your palms against copper jugs filled with lukewarm tea and call it luxury. during summer, you pray for wind, not a breeze wind. The kind that rustles the curtains and lets you believe, for 5 seconds, that maybe you're not melting from the inside out. In your free time, which is to say, your slightly less supervised time, you mop your sweat from the floor. Because slipping on your own perspiration would be an ironic way to break your neck. You dab it off your brow with the sleeve you're supposed to keep clean. You fan yourself with anything flat and hope no noble sees you doing it, lest you be accused of laziness, or worse, being visibly uncomfortable. The palace does provide some tools to battle the elements. Brazier fires for cold nights, shade tents for ceremonies in summer, but these are for the elite. You, meanwhile, are more likely to be the one fanning them with a peacock feather fan the size of your regret. A mainstream historical fact, palace architecture did include passive cooling designs, wind catchers, shaded arcades, and reflective pools. Beautiful and clever. Unless you're cleaning them, then they're slippery death traps lined with mosquito nurseries. As for heating, you make do with charcoal braziers, which double as silent assassins. Breathing carbon monoxide while trying to stay warm is the Empire's version of multitasking. There's a whole genre of ghost stories about palace servants who never woke up. Historians still argue whether palace eunuchs had better quarters than janissaries. Some claim you were pampered. Others suggest the only real difference was your door had a tassel. There's also the question of how much weather affected policy. Did a sultan's mood shift with the seasons? Did sweltering heat delay decisions of state? Probably. One fringe source blames an ill-timed snowstorm for a failed marriage proposal between royal families. Another blames the humidity for one eunuch, fainting mid-ceremony and landing directly in a soup tureen. His name was erased from records. The soup, unfortunately, wasn't. You fantasize about bathing in cold water, or hugging a hot brick, or walking into a room with steady temperature and no smoke. But mostly, you fantasize about weather not being a full-time enemy, about not checking the sky every morning like it's a passive-aggressive coworker, about not praying the next thunderstorm doesn't turn your sleeping mat into a sponge. But you wake, you sweat, you freeze, you carry on, because the palace is eternal, and the weather, just another test. Water in the Ottoman palace is everywhere and nowhere. You hear it bubbling gently in courtyard fountains, cascading down the edges of marble basins, echoing softly through hammams. It sounds luxurious, almost romantic. But as always, appearances lie, and in your case, they lie with the smoothness of an assassin's blade. You see, water is not just for sipping or bathing. It's a symbol of status, of control, of spiritual purity. But it's also an unpredictable force that can humble emperors and kill eunuchs with equal efficiency. You start your day parched, palace water, piped in through aqueducts and carried in cisterns. Might have trickled through centuries of stone, but not through a modern filter. Your cup might contain hints of lead, algae, or something vaguely wriggling. You sip anyway, slowly, because getting sick isn't a matter of if, but when. And yes, the palace has fountains, but they're more for show. You don't drink from them unless you're ready to explain to your supervisor why you've been throwing up in the rose garden. Again, bathing is an entirely different ordeal. It's not daily, it's barely weekly, and when it happens, it's ceremonial, supervised, and steamy in the way that scalds your pores and your dignity. The hammam is breathtakingly beautiful. Carved domes, marble slabs, pools of misty water. But as a eunuch, you're not there to relax. You're there to scrub someone else's back, or refill the copper bowls, or, if you're truly lucky, be ignored entirely. Bathing is both essential and risky. On the one hand, It's tied to ritual cleanliness. On the other, water was believed by many to awaken imbalances in the body. Translation: too many baths, and you might get ill. Not enough, and you absolutely will. There's a fringe belief at the time that steam makes the soul float, which sounds poetic until you remember that hallucinations caused by dehydration are also a thing. You sit in the bathhouse, sweat pooling under your knees, and think, am I transcending or just fainting, drinking water? That's even more complicated. The palace sometimes flavors it with rose or mint when available. Otherwise, you have two options: rainwater stored, stagnant or well water deep. Dubious. And if you drink too quickly or too much, congratulations, diarrhea. A humble, miserable way to spend a week contemplating your career path. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans fully understood waterborne diseases. Some records suggest an awareness of boiling. Others seem to indicate that foul-smelling water was fine as long as you said a prayer first. One eunuch famously insisted that chanting Bismillah could kill germs. He also died at 28 from what modern medicine would call a stomach parasite with ambition. As with everything in the palace, your access to water depends on hierarchy. Sultans bathe in perfumed spring water poured from golden ewers. You might splash your face in a wooden basin someone else already used, and then reuse that water to rinse your sandals. Hygiene is a matter of rotation. And then there are the floods. Occasionally, Istanbul's storms overwhelm the cisterns, sending rainwater sloshing down the tiled corridors. You mop with cloths that smell like every sickness you've ever feared. Water stains the silks, rusts the bowls, and finds its way under your mattress, just to remind you who's boss. So yes, water is life, and death, and ceremony, and chaos. It's in your dreams, in your lungs, and sometimes in your boots. You avoid it when you can, endure it when you must, and pray that the next cup doesn't kill you. Now, soften your breath. Let that last trickle of imagined water fade from your ears. You've scrubbed, carried, fetched, and poured for everyone but yourself. It's time to lie still. Let the hammam steam drift into mist. Let the splash of fountains blur into silence. Picture the marble halls cooling into night, the copper pitchers quiet, the bath fires dimmed. You've survived another day in the palace, and that, in this empire of illusion, is more than most. Some men, eager to upgrade wives or settle political scores, staged elaborate traps. One senator allegedly arranged for his wife's lover to sneak in through a fake servant entrance, then caught them accidentally and brought the whole neighborhood as witnesses. Fringe detail. The lover escaped through the same door he entered, but the wife wasn't so lucky. Historians still argue whether these laws ever applied equally. In theory, Rome was full of moral reform. In reality, the rich had lawyers, networks, and plausible deniability. A senator could discover an affair right after his wife inherited land. A general might accuse his rival's sister to discredit a family. It was less about virtue, more about power with adultery as a very dramatic excuse. And the public, they ate it up. Trials for adultery often turned into courtroom theater, complete with character witnesses, tearful servants, and, occasionally, stylized reenactments involving mannequins. Because if Rome loved anything more than conquest, it was spectacle. So here you are, balancing on a law built like a colander, designed to look solid but leak when needed. You dodge accusations, collect hush money, and pray to Venus that nobody finds the love letters you hid behind the Lair statue. And as you drift off, remember, the Lex Julia didn't stop cheating. It just made it official. You wake up mid-trial, somewhere nearby. A crowd is gasping politely, while a Roman man adjusts his toga like it's body armor. Welcome to the Roman court system, where vengeance is stylish, legal, and occasionally catered. You're not just watching a legal proceeding. You're watching one man's relationship meltdown become public entertainment, with extra olives on the side. Because in Rome, if your wife cheats, you don't cry about it. You litigate. Loudly. Preferably in front of everyone who matters. Let's be clear. A Roman husband couldn't just quietly stew in betrayal and move on with his life. That would be suspicious. The Lex Julia required him to report his wife's adultery. If he didn't, and someone else did, he could be prosecuted for pimping. Yes, that was the term. A man who knew about his wife's affair and allowed it to continue was essentially accused of profiting from her behavior, legally and morally. One mainstream fact: the moment a wife was convicted, her husband could reclaim her dowry, a tidy sum that might include land, slaves, or very lucrative vineyards. The motivation for pressing charges wasn't always heartbreak. Sometimes it was real estate. Of course, the trial itself was half courtroom, half soap opera. Witnesses testified in poetic monologues. Love letters were read aloud like bad slam poetry. One fringe account tells of the husband who hired actors to reenact the affair in court, complete with props, background music, and a dramatically opened curtain. Apparently, the judge applauded. And this wasn't just petty nobles. Senators, generals, even relatives of the emperor used adultery accusations as strategic tools. Got a political enemy with a beautiful wife. Accuse him of tolerating her behavior. Bonus points if you can produce a scandalous dinner guest list. Historians still argue whether most of these cases were genuine betrayals or just well-timed performances. Meanwhile, the wife, she didn't get much say. She might protest, produce counter-witnesses, or insist on divine dreams sent by Juno. But most of the time, her fate was sealed before her sandals hit the courtroom steps. Public opinion favored the husband as long as he seemed properly outraged and his tunic was clean. Occasionally, husbands went too far. One man, so eager to prosecute, accused not just his wife, but 4 of her alleged lovers, one of whom was his own cousin. The case collapsed, the family imploded, and the only winner was the bakery that sold cakes shaped like broken hearts. Still, the pattern-held adultery wasn't just punished, it was paraded. Romans didn't separate law from theater. Why whisper betrayal when you could scream it in front of a marble audience? And so, you lie back now, heavy with second-hand drama. Wondering how many husbands walked home from court, dowry in hand, pretending their bruised pride had nothing to do with dinner parties gone wrong. Justice in Rome was many things. Private was not one of them. You slide a paper door shut behind you, careful not to disturb the tatami mats or the silence, because here in feudal Japan, silence isn't awkward, it's judgment. You'd never think a glance could carry the weight of a guillotine, but one misstep in a samurai household, and even your shadow gets suspicious looks. Welcome to the land of blades and blushes, where adultery doesn't come with legal papers. It comes with a final bow. You tiptoe through a home ruled not just by husbands, but by the idea of honor, that ever-hungry ghost haunting every sword, scroll, and shared glance. The consequences of adultery weren't merely personal. They were structural. To betray your marriage was to betray your bloodline, your clan, your ancestors, your sword, and possibly your furniture arrangement. In other words, don't do it. One mainstream truth for members of the samurai class: marital infidelity, especially by a wife, could be punished by death, not after a long trial, but by the swift justice of a husband or his lord. No judge, no jury, just a quiet tisk, and then a very loud thud. For men, cheating wasn't great, but it was tolerated, as long as you didn't embarrass anyone or write poems about it. And that's the key embarrassment. If no one knew about the affair, it could be buried like an off-season kimono. But if gossip reached the neighbors, or worse, your daimyo, the situation escalated fast. Feudal justice had a sort of tiered elegance. A samurai husband might dispatch his wife and her lover in a single evening, wipe his blade, and return to finish his dinner. There are records of some men offering lovers the honorable option of suicide. Others were less polite and more stabby. There's a fringe tale of a jealous samurai who, upon suspecting his wife of an affair, calmly served tea to his guests while sending a servant to retrieve a bamboo mat soaked in river water. He later wrapped both lovers in it and left the bundle at the temple gates with a note that read, "Returned unclean." Historians still argue whether the story is literal or a moral parable, with surprisingly effective branding. And what of the women? Some were trained in onnana bugeisha arts, meaning they could fight. But few had real power in these matters. A wife suspected of infidelity might be shaved bald, a visible mark of disgrace. Others were cast out with no family name, no income, and no way to remarry. Even the lucky ones lived under layers of suspicion, watched not just by their husbands, but by mother-in-laws, retainers, and neighbors with very keen ears. Historians debate whether these punishments were truly about adultery or about preserving clan reputation. In a world where appearance trumped intimacy, maybe betrayal wasn't what you did, but what people found out. Honor, after all, had little patience for nuance, so as you slide your feet into warm socks. Imagine the quiet tension of a house where every rustle of silk could be a threat. Adultery here wasn't scandalous. It was fatal. You're standing in a courtyard that smells like plum blossoms and regret. The sun is setting over tiled rooftops, and someone is sharpening a tanto not for show, but for ceremony, because when an affair is discovered in feudal Japan, you don't get a scolding, you get options. Grim, poetic options, and none of them involve talking it out over herbal tea. Here, punishment is wrapped in etiquette. Death isn't chaotic, it's choreographed. The preferred method for a dishonored samurai male, seppuku ritual suicide by disembowelment, followed by a cleanup crew with better calligraphy than compassion. It's considered an honorable exit, though you'd be forgiven for having a slightly different opinion while holding the knife. Mainstream historical fact: male samurai caught in adultery, especially with a woman of equal or higher status, were sometimes granted the right to commit seppuku instead of facing execution. This wasn't kindness. It was image control, because nothing ruins a clan's weekend like public scandal involving someone's concubine and a poorly timed haiku. Women, though very different deal. A wife caught in adultery might be executed on the spot by her husband or handed over to her in-laws for something euphemistically called family discipline. Spoiler, it didn't involve stern lectures. Often it meant suffocation, strangulation, or drowning methods considered more dignified for women. Yes, drowning was dignified. That's how low the bar was. And then there's the fringe case, a regional lord in the 17th century who reportedly invited guests to a lavish dinner, only to reveal mid-meal that two attendees were engaged in an affair. He forced the lovers to duel each other while the other guests watched and commented politely. Like it was a chess match, the loser died. The winner was exiled. The chicken was reportedly excellent. Historians still argue whether the story is literal, exaggerated, or just proof that rich people have always been terrible at dinner parties. Of course, discretion played a major role. If a samurai could keep the scandal quiet, he might opt for more subtle revenge, shaving his wife's head and sending her to a convent, where she'd spend the rest of her life praying and rearranging rocks in the garden. One temple even had a special wing for fallen wives, a sort of spiritual purgatory with extra incense and very little small talk. And the lover, if they escape death, they might become a monk voluntarily or otherwise. There's an account of one man who found enlightenment shortly after being caught. Enlightenment, in this case, included no hair, no shoes, and a vow of silence longer than most marriages. Historians debate whether these punishments were actually common or simply exaggerated by later chroniclers trying to romanticize the brutality. But one thing's clear: feudal Japan wasn't interested in reconciliation. You didn't fix betrayal. You erased it so as you lie back now and let your thoughts drift past cherry trees and sliding doors. Remember, in this world, love was a weapon. and honor was a countdown. If you got caught, you didn't just pay a price. You became a cautionary tale. You shuffle quietly into the lacquered shadows of a samurai household, where even the koi seems suspicious. There's a scroll on the wall with delicate calligraphy, something about serenity and truth, but everyone in the room is trying not to blink too loudly. Because if there's one thing worse than committing adultery in feudal Japan, it's being suspected of it. And suspicion, that was a sport all its own. Samurai wives walked a line thinner than a katana edge, expected to be loyal, graceful, fertile, obedient, and ideally invisible unless pouring tea. They were also constantly monitored, and not just by men. Enter the Anazukuel, women appointed to spy on other women. Their job: read letters, note suspicious perfumes, and casually suggest that someone's sleeve was scented a little too sweetly. Think gossip with a government seal. Mainstream fact in high-ranking samurai households. Female attendants often served as informal surveillance, tasked with reporting on the lady of the house's behavior. These weren't jealous rivals. They were part of the home's internal security system, like human CCTV and silk robes. One particularly paranoid warlord had his wife's messages inspected daily and banned her from owning mirrors, claiming vanity was the first step toward disloyalty. Fringe detail. There's a tale about a noblewoman who used her pet crane to deliver secret notes to her lover in the next compound. It worked beautifully until the bird accidentally dropped one into the garden pond, where a servant fished it out and handed it straight to the lady's mother-in-law. The crane vanished. The lady disappeared from the records. Historians still argue whether these surveillance systems were effective at preventing actual adultery or just made everyone miserable and creatively anxious. After all, when a glance could mean execution, people got inventive, whispered poetry in fan folds, coded embroidery patterns, even rearranging calligraphy brushes as messages. It was espionage by flower arrangement, and suspicion was contagious. A woman's perceived flirtation could stain her entire family. A too long gaze at a visiting courtier might delay her brother's marriage proposal or cost her father a promotion. Because in this society, honor wasn't just personal, it was transferable, like a cursed heirloom you never asked for. Of course, not every accusation was genuine. Sometimes a jealous servant, a political rival, or even a bored relative could ruin a life with a well-placed rumor. One widow allegedly spent 20 years in a convent for an affair she never had, all because she laughed too loudly at a soldier's joke during dinner. Yet even in this suffocating web of suspicion, women found ways to resist. Some built reputations for spiritual purity so untouchable, no one dared question them. Others leaned into cunning faking illnesses, manipulating their own reputations, or redirecting blame so subtly it became a form of martial art. But in most cases, suspicion alone was enough. You didn't need proof, just timing, whispering bamboo, and a household that valued silence more than truth. So as you lie back under imaginary silk sheets and listen to the wind through sliding doors, remember, in feudal Japan, adultery didn't have to happen. Only suspicion did. You duck into a crowded Roman alley that smells like olives, sweat, and disappointment. A fishmonger argues with a baker. Laundry flaps above your head like surrender flags. This isn't the world of senators and samurai lords. This is the realm of commoners. And here, adultery is just as risky, just less poetic. There are no exile islands or formal duels, just fines, floggings, and the occasional public humiliation. Still charming, though, in a please don't look too closely kind of way. In both ancient Rome and feudal Japan, class shaped how adultery was punished. If you were poor, the law wasn't symbolic. It was sweaty and immediate. And if you were a woman, well, let's just say your options included be quiet, move away, or pray someone's too busy to notice. Mainstream fact: Roman lower-class men could take unfaithful wives to court. But most didn't bother. Trials were expensive, and so were bribes. Instead, informal punishments took place at the community level. Think neighbors scolding, employers docking wages, or mothers-in-law staging emotionally devastating interventions with bread and shame. One fringe anecdote tells of a Roman tanner who, upon catching his wife sneaking off with a butcher, paraded her through the market square wearing nothing but fish guts and irony. Not technically legal, but effective. She reportedly left town. So did the butcher in Japan. Commoners faced their own blend of legal and social repercussions. Adultery laws did exist, but enforcement varied wildly by region, magistrate mood, and the size of your rice harvest. A husband might drag his wife before a local official and demand she be branded, tattooed, or fined, sometimes. The punishment was exile to another village, sometimes just a forced divorce, and a lifetime of gossip. Men often faced no punishment at all unless they slept with someone's wife and forgot to be discreet. Then things got unpredictable. There's one rural record of a farmer being forced to dig a new irrigation trench as penance for stealing another man's honor. It worked. Apparently the crops were great that year. Historians still argue whether these double standards were formal law or just cultural practice passed down with the pickled radish recipes. But the result was the same women paid a heavier price. One misstep could lead to being disowned, unemployed, or worse, reclassified as available, which in both cultures meant unwanted attention and a harder life. And yet, the lower classes were often less judgmental than the elite. Why? Maybe because survival mattered more than scandal. If your neighbor had an affair but still helped with the harvest, did it really matter? That said, don't underestimate the power of gossip. In both societies, rumors moved faster than oxen and stuck longer than ink. So you sit now on the cracked Roman stoop or a weathered Japanese porch, watching the world judge and forgive in uneven doses. No trials, no scrolls, just weary people trying to make love work in systems that rarely gave them space to breathe. Adultery didn't only break hearts, it broke social math. You're standing in a Roman forum with a crowd that's far too excited for a legal proceeding. Breadcrumbs scatter on the stone floor, pigeons strut like they own the place, and someone's brought figs like it's a picnic. Because today isn't just another trial, it's a public shaming. And whether in Rome or feudal Japan, when someone breaks the unspoken contract of fidelity, the punishment isn't complete until it's seen. Adultery, it turns out, was never a private matter. It was performance art with real consequences. In Rome, a woman caught cheating might be paraded through the streets wearing a veil that said, "I made bad choices, and now I walk on cobblestones while strangers hiss at me." It wasn't enough to exile her, she had to be unmade. One judgmental stare at a time. One mainstream fact: Roman punishments for women found guilty of adultery could include public humiliation rituals. These sometimes involved barefoot walks through public squares, public declarations of disgrace, and a formal stripping of citizen status, essentially being unfriended by an entire empire. And that wasn't even the weirdest part. There's a fringe tale about a senator's wife forced to wear a donkey mask in public for a year, supposedly because her lover was a lowly stable boy, a symbol of bestial association. Yes, but also a chance for every shopkeeper in town to get in a daily laugh. Whether or not it happened, the rumor alone did the job. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, shaming worked differently. It wasn't loud, it was silent and excruciating. A dishonored woman might be expelled from her home, her head shaved, her family crest revoked. She might be made to wear unpatterned robes, the textile equivalent of a scarlet letter. If she was lucky, she was sent to a distant province. If she was unlucky, she stayed surrounded by neighbors who no longer saw her face, only her failure. Historians still argue whether these symbolic punishments were more effective than physical ones. After all, a beating heals, but a public shame ritual that echoes for generations. Entire family lines could be tainted. A younger sister's marriage prospects might vanish. A son's rank in court might drop 3 notches all because mom made the mistake of glancing too long at someone else's bento box. In both cultures, the humiliation wasn't just for the woman. Sometimes the lover got his share, especially if he was lower status. One Roman man was reportedly tattooed with the word adulterer on his forehead. Another was forced to wear women's clothing for a week in the market. Again, scholars debate if these were laws or very enthusiastic urban legends. But either way, the public had front row seats, and so now. As you lie back imagining veiled figures and shaved heads disappearing down narrow streets, remember the worst punishment wasn't exile. It was memory. You wander now into the hush that follows scandal. The crowds have gone home. The scrolls have been rolled away, and the punishment robes hang limp on pegs in the corner. What's left is the long quiet, the part no law touches, because after the stonings, the exiles, the shaved heads, and the theatrical courtroom gasps, the aftermath lives in families, in silences, in whispered questions no one really wants answered. Adultery wasn't just a crime. It was a story that people kept retelling long after the rice was harvested or the toga was folded away. A stain on a family name. A reason someone's daughter didn't get a good marriage. An explanation for why a household's laughter never came back. And yet, people still risked it. For desire, for revenge, for freedom, or just, sometimes, for the sheer thrill of saying, I'm more than a role someone handed me. One mainstream fact in both ancient Rome and feudal Japan. Family was the center of legal, social, and moral order. When adultery occurred, the punishment rippled outward, damaging networks, dowries, lineages, and honor debts. It was less about the couple and more about everyone else who now had to pretend they weren't looking. And in that delicate, post-scandal space, something strange could happen. Forgiveness, quiet arrangements, silent partnerships that moved forward as though nothing happened. Historians still argue whether these resolutions were rare or just undocumented. After all, the most successful reconciliations don't make it into law books. They make it into the rhythm of daily life shared meals, rearranged rooms, a new emphasis on caution. There's a fringe story, possibly apocryphal, about a Roman woman caught in adultery who was divorced, shamed, and sent away, only to be quietly brought back a year later, her ex-husband claiming she was a different woman. She probably was. Different, older, less romantic, and maybe just better at keeping secrets. They lived together for another decade. Nobody asked questions. And in a small Japanese village, an old gravestone tells of a woman who returned to the house and served tea until her death. No name, no date, just that. A quiet footnote to a life that once burned too brightly in the wrong direction. So now, your eyes close, and the world of sharp swords and crumbling marble fades. No more trials. No more gossip. No more whispered accusations floating through rice paper walls. Just the slow breath of history settling down, tucking you in with the realization that human desire, clumsy, hungry, reckless, is the same in every era. But the consequences, oh, those are always dressed for drama. Let your thoughts drift now. Not through scandal, but through stillness. Let the fires die out. The crowds dissolve. The old rules fold neatly into dust. The stories have been told. The robes laid flat. The shame, the justice, the mercy, whatever was dealt has passed. Sleep now, and dream only of quiet now. We walk into a house where the atrium smells like wine, sweat, and the kind of secrets only marble walls can keep. You glide across mosaic floors, careful not to trip on the hem of a stola. Everything's pristine except the people. Roman nobles stroll around pretending they're gods, but behind those gold-trimmed tunics are jealous husbands, manipulative wives, and lovers who should have run faster. You would never think that having an affair could lead to being exiled to a rock in the middle of the sea, but welcome to ancient Rome, where adultery isn't just scandalous, it's a civic offense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who else can't sleep. Now, back to the whispers behind the columns. You trudge past statues of Venus and Mars, the deities of love and war, conveniently parked next to each other, and realize that Romans took both topics a little too seriously. Adultery, in particular, was a weird blend of divine offense and political inconvenience. Because in Rome, cheating wasn't just a private mess, it was public business. The Lex Julia, a set of moral laws passed by Augustus in 18 BCE, made adultery a criminal act. That's right, the emperor, who famously couldn't keep his own house in order, decided to legislate romance. Under this law, a husband who caught his wife in the act could within reason kill the lover on the spot. He had to do it quickly. Though, no post-bath reflection, and only if the guy was of low social rank. Nobles got more paperwork. The wife, meanwhile, could be divorced, humiliated, and exiled. Augustus even punished his own daughter Julia under this law, shipping her off to a tiny island with zero nightlife and plenty of shame. You'd think being the emperor's daughter might help, but nope, apparently. Nothing ruins a family faster than sleeping with too many poets. Historians still argue whether Augustus truly believed in moral reform, or if this was just a sneaky way to control the aristocracy through their bedsheets. It's hard to say, but what's clear is that Roman society treated adultery like a mix between a legal proceeding and a reality show. People loved a scandal, especially one involving someone else's toga. And of course, double standards were part of the architecture. A man caught cheating might face a raised eyebrow or a sarcastic toast at dinner. A woman, she might lose her home, her money, her children, and any last shred of social protection. Some wives tried to defend themselves by blaming their lovers for seduction, manipulation, or dark omens from Jupiter. It rarely worked. One fringe detail, some Roman households allegedly kept secret rooms or hidden staircases, escape routes for lovers when footsteps echoed down the hall. Adultery wasn't just a risk, it was practically a sport. So now, as you settle into your pillow, remember marble columns may look sturdy, but they were built around fragile egos. And in Rome, love was never just about feelings. It was about status, spectacle, and surviving the morning gossip. You slip down a candlelit corridor where senators whisper more about silk sheets than statecraft. Welcome to the fine print of the Lex Julia, Rome's official no funny business policy, which, ironically, led to a lot of very funny business. On paper, it's clear adultery is a crime. In practice, well, you need a map, a bribe, and possibly a cousin in the judiciary to figure it all out. The Lex Julia de Adulterius Coercendus tries saying that 3 times while holding your dignity was Augustus's attempt to make Rome morally great again. It criminalized adultery for the first time, forcing husbands to report unfaithful wives or risk being seen as complicit. But here's the fun part. The law was full of conditions, exceptions, and more loopholes than a gladiator's net. To start, if a man caught his wife in the act, he had to act fast, like still adjusting his tunic fast. He had the right to kill her lover, but only if the lover was of lower status, like an actor, slave, or someone with suspiciously unpolished sandals. If the lover was a fellow noble that called for a lawsuit, not a sword. One mainstream fact: women caught in adultery could lose their dowries, be barred from remarrying, and be exiled to remote islands. A popular destination for disgraced aristocratic women was Pandateria, basically the Roman version of your sleeping on the couch, except the couch is a volcanic rock surrounded by sharks. Meanwhile, the lover could be punished too, but many found clever ways to vanish, plead innocence, or point fingers back at the husband for neglecting his sacred marital duties. In other words, she cheated, but also, you're kind of boring now. We sit beneath the dust-colored sky of a wandering camp in the Sinai Desert, your sandals barely holding together, your water skin warm and disappointing. You've just been told you can't eat shrimp anymore, or bacon, or that delicious roasted camel you tried once on a dare. It's not because they're bad, it's because they are unholy. You would never think that your eternal soul could be swayed by crustaceans. But welcome to divine dietary law. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and local time down in the comments. I always love seeing who's listening from where. You trudge past a campfire where a priest is reciting Leviticus like it's a menu, except everything on it is crossed out. Pork forbidden, shellfish forbidden, fats from certain animals. Definitely know if it has a cloven hoof and doesn't chew cud, or vice versa. Into the sin bin it goes. That's a mainstream fact. Ancient Jewish dietary law was precise, detailed, and spiritually enforced with the kind of intensity we now reserve for airport security. And it wasn't just about avoiding certain foods. It was about separating the holy from the ordinary. The rule book, which might as well be subtitled How to Ruin Your Favorite Picnic, made eating a sacred act. Kosher laws dictated not only what you could eat, but how, when, and with what utensils. It was theology by table setting. Now cue the Roman general. Lucius Flavius Fistus, almost definitely not his real name, who once sent herds of pigs stampeding into a Jewish encampment just to desecrate the area. A very porky form of psychological warfare. That fringe tidbit reminds us that food bans weren't just personal, they were political. Enemies knew what sacred meant, and they knew how to weaponize a well-timed ham. Shellfish, meanwhile, had the audacity to live in water and not have fins or scales. Lobsters, sea insects, crabs, walking abominations. According to Leviticus, these creatures were not merely unclean, they were offensive in a "you've disrespected the divine design" kind of way. Which is impressive, considering they're just trying to scuttle along and look vaguely prehistoric. And then there's fat. Certain fats were reserved for sacrificial offerings, meaning if you ate them, you were basically mugging God mid-worship. That's not just a culinary mistake, it's a theological felony. Historians still argue whether these laws were rooted in health precautions, tribal identity, or a divine micromanagement phase. Some suggest pork was banned due to risk of disease. Others say it was about cultural distinction, like fashion, but edible. After all, nothing says we're different from the Babylonians like rejecting their barbecue, and the impact of these rules, long-lasting. They shaped markets, migration patterns, even architecture. Ever wonder why certain communities have double kitchens or separate dish sets? You can thank an ancient priest with a bone to pick about goat milk. So as you curl up now and picture a banquet table that's half empty but spiritually full, remember, in some traditions, not eating is a declaration of faith. And pork is personal. You crouch beside a dusty trail somewhere near ancient Canaan, clutching a list of animals that sounds suspiciously like a dare. You've just spotted a rabbit, cute, twitchy, perfect stew material. But no, rabbits chew cud, you're told, but they don't have split hooves. So, tragically, they are off the menu. Camels also banned. Chew cud, yes. Split hoof, no. It's dietary jeopardy. And your dinner just got demoted to a theological riddle. In the book of Leviticus, the kosher laws read like a zoologist. Lost a bet with a priest. Every land animal must tick 2 boxes, chew cud, and have split hooves. Cows check. Goats, welcome to the party. But camels, despite their charming eyelashes and chewy cud routine, have disqualified feet. That single hoof business makes them ritually unclean. Sorry. Desert dwellers, mainstream fact. The camel ban stuck hard in Jewish tradition, even though camels were common in trade and travel. They were tolerated as transportation, just not as tacos. Rabbits got similar treatment. Despite not technically chewing cud, they engage in a practice called refection, a gentle euphemism for eating their own droppings. From a distance, it looked like cud chewing. From up close, it looked like a hard no. And now, the fringed gem, medieval monks in parts of Europe. Faced with Lent and its meat bans, argued that baby rabbits, specifically unborn or just born ones, were aquatic. Why? Because they looked sort of like fish. Logic so flexible, you could stretch it across a monastery courtyard. Some monastic orders kept rabbit farms and proudly declared their faith and their fillets. Historians still argue whether the church turned a blind eye out of practicality or shared in the delicious self-deception in Islamic dietary law. Meanwhile, rabbits are fair game, but camels are hotly debated. They're allowed in many interpretations, but still draw side eyes from more conservative scholars. You get the sense that, even today, some foods never fully leave the gray zone. So what's the purpose of all this cud chewing? Hoof-counting culinary taxonomy. Some believe it was a way to create boundaries. Others argue it was ancient dietary science, disguised as religious decree, avoiding animals with higher parasite loads. Maybe. Or just keeping people from eating everything that walked. One rabbi in the Talmud even wrote that the list was more about obedience than logic. It's not about understanding why the camel's foot offends the divine. It's about not questioning that it does, which is, ironically, a very human way of showing faith, asking you to resist roast camel when you're starving. And let's be real. You've probably never questioned the hoof status of your dinner. You live in a world of shrink-wrapped options and best by dates. But back then, dinner could be a spiritual minefield. One wrong meal, and suddenly you're not just breaking a rule, you're becoming symbolically impure. So now, as you drift toward sleep, remember, you're not your cud, your hooves, or your legal classification, but your dinner might be. You stand at the edge of a sacrificial altar, nose wrinkling at the coppery scent rising from freshly spilled blood. Not your blood, thankfully, but someone's dinner's blood. And here's the twist. It's not being spilled for seasoning or flavor. It's being spilled for purification. Because in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, blood isn't just messy, it's sacred, symbolically powerful, and completely off limits for consumption. You would never think that swallowing a drop of it could curse your entire week. But here we are. Mainstream fact, all three Abrahamic religions strictly prohibit the consumption of blood. In Jewish law, meat must be kashered, soaked, and salted until every last trace of blood has wept out into a bowl. In Islam, halal slaughter includes a similar requirement. The animal's throat is slit so that blood drains quickly, ensuring the meat is ritually clean. Even early Christianity, when it wasn't debating fish-wine compatibility, echoed the blood ban in the Acts of the Apostles, instructing converts to avoid meat with blood still in it. You didn't just avoid blood because it was gross. You avoided it because it represented life. Life that belonged to God, not to your stew pot. To eat blood was to claim something divine. That's a theological mic drop with a side of food poisoning. And then there's the fringe detail in the Middle Ages. Horrific rumors known as blood libel swept through Christian Europe. One infamous claim insisted that Jewish communities were kidnapping Christian children to use their blood in Passover rituals. absolutely false, completely toxic, and tragically influential. These lies led to pogroms, expulsions, and centuries of simmering violence over a dish that never existed. Historians still argue whether these accusations were driven by religious misunderstanding or convenient scapegoating. Spoiler, it was both. Islamic law also condemns blood drinking, not just in meals, but as a sign of pagan rituals. In fact, some early caliphs made a point of linking their enemies to blood sacrifices just to score spiritual points. Meanwhile, in Jewish households, the act of salting and soaking meat became its own domestic ritual. Meat was soaked in cold water, salted on both sides, and left to rest so the blood could weep out. It's the culinary version of confession. And for early Christians, there was a bit of whiplash. On one hand, they denounced blood as part of pagan excess. On the other hand, they held communion a ritual that symbolically drank the blood of Christ. Try explaining that theological contradiction to a hungry Roman centurion who just wanted a lamb chop. It's less cannibalism, more metaphor. But still, if your religion opens with take, drink, this is my blood, don't be surprised when the neighbors raise an eyebrow. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about health, holiness, or hierarchy. Was the blood ban a way to prevent contamination, or was it just another method to remind everyone you're part of something sacred? And sacred things require sacrifice. So now, as you settle down under a sky full of stars and absolutely no rare stakes, remember in these ancient worlds, blood wasn't just life, it was law. You raise your cup in a candlelit monastery or a bustling Jerusalem courtyard and hesitate because what's in that cup might be celebration, or it might be sin. Wine, that sweet, fermented troublemaker, plays a starring role in scripture and scandal alike. It's holy enough to be called a fruit of the vine, but also dodgy enough to get you excommunicated, or at least aggressively side-eyed. You would never think that fermented grapes could confuse a millennium of theologians. But here comes the hangover of history. In Judaism, wine is a big deal. It sanctifies everything from Sabbath dinners to weddings and even funerals. A blessing over wine is like divine punctuation. Every major sentence in life ends with a sip. That's your mainstream fact. Jewish tradition not only allows wine, it elevates it. Kosher wine has to be made by Jews, untouched by non-Jews during fermentation. Why? Because ancient pagans loved to use wine in idol rituals, and you definitely don't want your Cabernet spiritually compromised. Now, Christianity, especially early on, took wine and turned it into theological performance art. At the Last Supper, Jesus holds up a cup and essentially says, "This is my blood. Drink it." And somehow, the dinner party continues. The symbolic use of wine in the Eucharist became foundational, central to Mass, communion, and centuries of liturgical choreography. But it also created a minor branding problem, preaching abstinence while promoting holy wine shots every Sunday. Many early Christian sects debated it endlessly, especially those in regions where alcohol wasn't a casual affair, but a potent force for public disorder. Cue the fringed gem, Caliph al-Walid II of the Umayyad dynasty reportedly outlawed alcohol while simultaneously commissioning a private garden filled with grapevines. His court poet once wrote about wine rivers and drunken angels, which feels like an ancient version of I can quit any time I want. Historians still argue whether he was a hypocrite, a misunderstood poet, or just really bad at hiding hangovers. Islam, in its legal foundations, takes a stricter stance: no alcohol. Full stop. The Quran doesn't start off that way. It gradually tightens the prohibition. First, don't drink before prayer. Then, avoid it altogether. By the end, forbidden. One might say the divine message sobers up over time. But Islamic history isn't monolithic. In some dynasties, like the Abbasids, court life was practically a wine-tasting club with poetry. And yet, commoners caught drinking might face lashes or worse. It all depended on who you were and who was watching. And just when things get clear, along comes Christianity's temperance movement, which looked at 800 years of church wine and said, no more. Suddenly, wine was out, grape juice was in, and communion started to taste like diluted jelly. Historians still argue whether these wine bans were spiritual safeguards or just efforts to keep priests from dancing on tables. After all, banning wine in the ancient world was like banning Wi-Fi. Today, it disrupted everything. But no one wanted to admit it. So as you drift toward dreams, with the ghost of a goblet in hand, remember, some drinks refresh, others reveal. But in the ancient world, that sip might say more about your soul than your thirst. You lean over the edge of a dock, eyeing a fish that looks suspiciously delicious and spiritually questionable. It's got no scales. It slithers like a water serpent, and it practically dares you to eat it. But beware, your religious dietary law just turned into an aquatic riddle. You would never think a catfish could threaten your eternal soul. But in the sacred kitchen, even sea creatures are put on trial. Let's start with Judaism, where the Torah doesn't just tell you what fish to eat, it tells you what type of fish soul you should have. Mainstream fact, kosher seafood must have both fins and scales. That means salmon holy sushi, tuna. Kind of controversial, but okay. Eels, catfish, sharks, and anything that looks like it belongs in an alien movie. Absolutely not. The logic may sound fishy, but the rules are clear. No scales, no salvation. Islam, on the other hand, casts a wider net. Halal law generally permits all seafood through some schools of thought. Like the Hanafi, get a bit stricter, preferring only fish-shaped fish. If it walks, crawls, or gives you the ick, it's frowned upon. But here's where it gets weird. Jellyfish are technically not fish, but you can find Muslim scholars who've weighed in on their edibility. Spoiler not appetizing, but debatably permissible. So, yes, there's an entire theological debate about whether you can eat a floating water balloon. Now brace yourself for the fringe story in medieval Europe. During Christian fasting seasons, especially, Lent meat was forbidden. So clever monks got creative. They baptized beavers. Literally. Since the tail was flat and scaly, they decided it counted as a fish. That meant they could munch on beaver during Lent with full spiritual smugness. Later, this aquatic category expanded to include whales, puffins, and possibly confused ducks. Historians still argue whether these dietary loopholes were born from divine insight or religiously motivated hunger strikes. Meanwhile, back in the more official world, early Christians embraced fish as a symbol of faith and sustenance. The famous ichthys fish symbol was practically the logo of underground Christianity. Fish became a holy workaround, something you could eat on fast days without ticking off heaven. Some bishops went so far as to declare seals and walruses as honorary fish. Because, really, who was going to check? And yet, even within traditions, lines blur. Some Sephardic Jews accept swordfish because of its baby scale phase. Others reject it for its adult nudity. This leaves modern kosher diners having to Google photos of fish like nervous first dates. Does it scale? Did it used to scale? Can I eat it in good conscience, or will my grandmother sense it from another city? Historians still argue whether these fish rules were about health, symbolism, or the divine joy of frustrating seafood lovers. Some say avoiding bottom feeders kept people from eating disease-prone creatures. Others believe it marked boundaries, drawing a line between chosen people and chowder. So now, as your dreams drift underwater, past kosher cod and halal haddock, know this: in ancient kitchens, even dinner had to pass a spiritual swim test. You sit cross-legged near a stone hearth, staring at a roasted leg of lamb that smells divine and carries a moral dilemma. It's not the seasoning, the source, or even the species. It's who cooked it. More precisely, it's whose table you're sitting at. Because in the eyes of ancient Jewish, Christian, and Islamic law, eating the wrong food is bad, but eaten with the wrong person, potentially worse. You would never think dinner could be a spiritual minefield. But go ahead. Try explaining your lunch guest to a medieval rabbi. Mainstream fact in all three Abrahamic faiths: sharing meals with outsiders, especially those of different religions or ritual practices, has often been viewed with suspicion. In Jewish tradition, eating food prepared by non-Jews was historically restricted, not just for dietary safety, but to prevent assimilation. That's how bishul akum food cooked by a non-Jew came into being. The idea is that friendly dinners led to friendships, and friendships led to marriages, and marriages led to someone's future grandchild serving pork at a wedding. Islamic scholars developed similar caution. The Quran permits eating the food of the people of the book, Jews and Christians. But interpretations varied wildly. Some argued that food shared at a Christian feast might still be halal, while others saw any communal meal as a compromise. And don't even get them started on meat from a Hindu neighbor's table. Accepting food wasn't just politeness, it was theology with tableware. Now for the fringe anecdote. There's a tale of a rabbi in 15th century Spain who was invited to dine at a royal court banquet. Knowing the food wasn't kosher, he brought his own dried bread and sat under the table, nibbling silently while everyone feasted above. It was either a profound act of faith or the most dramatic BYO moment in history. Historians still argue whether this really happened or if it's rabbinic legend gone rogue, but the image sticks: quiet protest in a room full of roast duck. Early Christians had their own struggles. The Apostle Paul famously tangled with whether new converts could eat meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. His take: technically yes, but don't flaunt it. The meat might be fine, but if someone else sees you chowing down and thinks idolatry's cool now, congratulations, you've just spiritually sabotaged someone over a mutton chop. It's the earliest recorded case of religious dietary peer pressure. Social meals weren't just about nourishment. They were identity politics in edible form. Accepting a meal could be seen as accepting the worldview that produced it. Declining could start a feud. Entire legal codes grew around when and how you could break bread across belief systems. Sometimes compromise came in the form of separate dishes. Other times, it came in the form of not showing up at all. Historians still argue whether these food-sharing taboos were about preserving faith or preventing awkward interfaith romances. Possibly both. After all, nothing accelerates a forbidden relationship like mutual hunger and too much wine. So as your eyes start to close and the banquet fades from sight, remember, sometimes the most controversial part of a feast wasn't the food. It was the guest list. You hunch over a table set with nothing. Just a lonely bowl of air. Maybe a wilted fig someone forgot to hide. Around you, others are quietly chewing nothing, praying more than chewing, their stomachs negotiating with the clock. You've landed in the high season of religious fasting, where the faithful avoid food not because there's none available, but because the divine calendar says so. You would never think that hunger could be spiritual performance art, but welcome to the Holy Hunger Games. Mainstream fact: all three major Abrahamic religions incorporate fasting into their rhythm of worship. Judaism gives you Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, full-day fast with no food, no water, and definitely no cheating via breath mints. Christianity, especially in its medieval Catholic flavor, blessed the world with Lent, a 40-day boot camp of culinary restrictions, at least on paper. Islam, of course, centers fasting around Ramadan, where no food or drink is allowed from sunrise to sunset, followed by glorious nightly feasts. In every case, fasting wasn't about dieting. It was about discipline, repentance, and tuning out earthly cravings. But did that stop people from trying to bend the rules? Of course not. Cue the fringe tale of the inventive monk who reportedly deep-fried bread in animal fat during Lent and then claimed it was air encased in a holy crust. Bread was banned, air was not. The loophole, brilliant. The sin, questionable. Historians still argue whether religious fasting inspired spiritual discipline or just turned everyone into legalistic chefs with the creativity of jazz musicians. Even the rules changed depending on where you were. Some regions allowed fish during Lent, leading to culinary reinterpretations of animals. Remember the beaver tail as fish incident? Well, the puffin, yes. The adorable seabird was once declared an honorary fish by French monks just so they could eat it without guilt. Somewhere, a divine being surely raised an eyebrow in Islam. Fasting during Ramadan became not only a personal commitment, but a social spectacle. Cities transformed at night with the sounds of prayers, feasts, and the soft rustle of date palms. One fringe tradition even claims some rulers had professional wake-up drummers people paid to roam the streets before dawn, banging pots so you wouldn't sleep through your pre-fast snack. Forget alarm clocks, try being spiritually startled awake every morning for a month. In Jewish tradition, fasting carried emotional weight. Yom Kippur isn't just no food, it's no washing, no leather shoes, no physical pleasure of any kind. The idea is to strip away comfort, so all that's left is you and the Almighty, hopefully not too annoyed. One rabbinic debate even asked, if someone eats in their dream during a fast, do they have to repent when they wake up? A valid question, especially if your dream feast was really good. Historians still argue whether these fasts were sincere paths to purification or cleverly disguised methods of crowd control. After all, a hungry citizen is too tired to sin, let alone riot. So as your stomach settles and your breathing slows, remember this in ancient faiths. Hunger wasn't an accident. It was a ritual, a sacred growl in the silence. You walk into a kitchen where nothing smells quite right. There's meat, but it's been sacrificed. Bread, but it's been blessed by someone your rabbi warned you about. And in the center of the room, a table filled with foods that might just be cursed, depending on who you ask. Because some foods, it turns out, weren't banned for their ingredients, but for their associations. You would never think that hummus could have theological baggage, but in the ancient world, even a chickpea could carry scandal. Mainstream fact in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. The spiritual status of food often depended not just on what it was, but who had touched it and why. The Mishnah, for instance, details cases where food becomes tarifa, non-kosher, because it was offered to an idol, even if technically it followed all the kosher rules. Similarly, early Christian converts debated whether meat sold in pagan markets could be safely eaten, or if it was contaminated by invisible gods clinging to the ribs. Paul, the apostle, had thoughts. In his letters, he essentially shrugged and said, "The idols aren't real, so the meat is fine. But don't eat it in front of anyone who thinks it's wrong." This is biblical guidance for the original passive-aggressive dinner party. Sure, eat the roast lamb, but maybe whisper it if Timothy's around in Islam. This concept emerges in the prohibition of haram foods, things not only ritually impure, but also associated with sin or disbelief. Food offered in polytheistic rituals, forbidden. Drink from a cup used in a gambling house, best to skip it. The act of eating becomes a statement not just about nourishment, but allegiance. Now for the fringe slice in some medieval Christian towns. It was believed that cheese left out on All Hallows' Eve could be inhabited by spirits. Eat it. And you didn't just get indigestion, you got a personal haunting. Cheese as spiritual doorway. Historians still argue whether these ideas came from local superstition or opportunistic monks who wanted a better share of the pantry. Jewish dietary law took extra care when it came to wine. Wine touched by non-Jews was off limits, especially if it could have been used in idolatrous libations. That meant if your pagan neighbor borrowed your wine jug and didn't explain what he was doing with it, congrats. It's now impure. Better spill it than risk drinking divine backwash. Christianity. During its expansion into Europe, encountered this problem in reverse. Converts brought old traditions, harvest feasts, solstice meals, mead offerings to tree gods. And while the church tried to redirect the party towards saints and virgins, it wasn't always clear where the line was. One bishop supposedly banned honey cakes because they smelled of Saturnalia. That's when you know your religion's serious. When baked goods are accused of ancient Roman orgies. Historians still argue whether these food taboos helped reinforce purity or just made everyone paranoid. Either way, it worked. By tying food to belief, you turned every bite into a confession. So now, as you lie back and imagine ancient kitchens whispering their secrets, remember sometimes, food wasn't just food, it was faith, dressed as dinner. You sit quietly now. The clatter of ancient spoons and theological forks finally fading. No more dream banquets. No puffin labeled as fish. No rabbi hiding under royal tables with travel bread. Just the soft hum of silence and the aftertaste of the 6,000 years of belief-infused cuisine. You would never think that dinner could be a spiritual war zone. But that's what happens when faith walks into the kitchen wearing an apron and a law code. Mainstream, fact-forbidden foods weren't always about health or flavor or logic. Sometimes they were about identity, about being not like them. Avoiding pork wasn't just about hygiene. It was a badge, a border, a whispered declaration of us versus them on every plate, whether it was kosher, halal, or during a holy fast. Food rules carved civilizations into separate dining rooms. Even now, in modern cities with vegan delis and microwave halos, these ancient codes echo. People still check labels for ingredients that trace back to commandments older than the Latin alphabet. And yet, somewhere along the way, forbidden foods became nostalgic. Recipes were reimagined, substitutes invented. Faux bacon, blessed by rabbis. Halal marshmallows. Vegan Eucharist, wafers. The lines between purity and possibility blurred. And the kitchen adapted again. Fringe truth. There's a community of scholars still debating whether locusts are kosher. Yes, locusts. Some say only certain types. Others say all are fine. depending on your grandmother's pronunciation of Schistokerka. It's the edible insect equivalent of arguing over fonts. Historians still argue whether religious food laws were divine design or the earliest form of community branding. But what's clear is this food was never just about survival. It was about memory, morality, mystery, and occasionally mischief. Like the time monks baptized birds, or the time Islamic poets praised wine in public while privately swearing it off. Humans, after all, are gloriously inconsistent. Our stomachs want dinner. Our souls want meaning. Sometimes they argue. And now, as your breathing slows and your limbs sink into soft sheets, let the images of sacred dinners and forbidden feasts fade gently. Imagine the quiet crackle of bread torn beside candlelight. The scent of spice that once drifted through temple courtyards. The hush before the first sip at sundown after a day of fasting. Let it all dissolve. No idols. No laws. Just you, the dark, and the strange comfort that across centuries and continents, someone else also paused before taking a bite and wondered if their dinner was holy